after this talk. Okay. Um, Now, Christopher Bird, who is our speaker tonight, is an award-winning film editor and director who's made a series of film history documentaries with Oscar-winning historian Kevin Brownlow. He's been researching Norfolk's First and Second World War anti-invasion defences since 1990. He wrote a series of articles about them for the Norfolk Industrial Archaeology Society and also a book about them published by the Larks Press in 1999 called Silent Sentinels. He contributed his research into Norfolk's First World War defences to Historic England, a group which in turn was able to get several of the sites listed last year. He visits Norfolk several times a year and is still discovering previously unknown pillboxes. And tonight, as you know, that will be his theme, First World War pillboxes of Norfolk. Over to you, Chris, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary. That's lovely of you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for receiving me in your homes tonight. It's very kind of you, and I'm thrilled to be here. So today we're going to be looking at the most iconic reminder of an event that no one even knows about, which is the First World War invasion threat against England, an event that most people aren't aware of even existing. And even more than a century on, there are not many, but there are a handful of these scattered reminders around the Norfolk countryside. And the people that built these things or would have manned these things are no longer with us. So we have to look primarily at an archaeological approach to try and make sense of these remains. Now, this talk is going to be in three sections. The first will just be really the strategic background to this event. The second part of the talk will look at the pillboxes themselves and the different designs. And then to finish with, we're going to look at what happened to them after the end of the First World War. So to start with, Norfolk, First World War invasion threats. I mean, this is, an extraordinary thing to most people. Most of us will have heard of Operation Sea Lion and the 1940 German invasion threat, immortalised, of course, by things like Dad's Army. But the First World War threat is really largely forgotten. But the interesting thing is that there was a huge amount of invasion scare literature leading up to the First World War, something like 40 novels. The only one that's famous today is The Riddle of the Sands from 1903, but there were dozens of these things. It was a huge genre. And I'm going to start looking not at one of these invasion scare novels, but this wasn't consigned to literature. Cinema as well had its share of these. And I'm just going to show you a 2-minute clip from a film you may not have heard of from 1909 called The Airship Destroyer. Just bear with me. Screen share. Okay. Hopefully you can see this. There's no sound on this. There would originally have been live music in the cinema, but this is this 1909 film, The Airship Destroyer. I'm just going to show you 2 minutes. So these are the English, and they're shocked to see through their binoculars this. Now, this would have been regarded as science fiction in 1909. Just for context, the Wright brothers' first flight is just 6 years earlier than this film. And in fact, cinema itself is only 14 years old when this film was made. So this is very much a film capitalizing on a very popular threat of the time. And as I say, it's just a clip, but what's happened is the inventor here has invented a thing he calls the aerial torpedo, with which he's going to try and keep Britain safe. And this is a surface-to-air missile that he's created. But this would have been, crude as the model shots are, this film would have been terrifying for audiences in 1909. 1909, no one had yet been bombed by the air, but it's quite a prophetic film because Norfolk, in fact, became the first place in Britain bombed this way. In 1915, there was a raid that hit King's Lynn and Sheringham and Yarmouth that would have been bombed, not dissimilar to this. We even have this sort of prototype tank. And tanks don't come into existence for another 7 years after this film was made. So it's quite an interesting piece of science fiction, but I say one that would have connected very much in the popular imagination. And in the portion of the film I'm going to show you today, this is just the early bit, so the aerial torpedo doesn't get launched yet, so things are not looking good in this section of the film. But I say residents of Norfolk underwent almost exactly what you see in this film early on in the First World War. Right, we can hold that there. So I'm going to come out of screen share. Right. Now, I mentioned invasion scale literature. The one that's very overlooked today, but it's very interesting for our talk, is a 1906 novel called The Invasion of England 1910. And the reason it's interesting is a major part of the invasion targets the North Norfolk coast. And the ships in that book land at Weybourne, right in the middle of North Norfolk, because of the very deep water. So if you can bear with me, I'm going to quote a couple of paragraphs from it, which will give the idea of what the pillboxes feed into a few years later. Just before dawn on Sunday morning, I was in the boat with my son Ted off the Robin Friend, that's just west of Sheringham, by the way, taking up the lobster pots, when we suddenly saw about 3 miles offshore a mixed lot of curious-looking craft strung out right across the horizon and heading apparently for Cromer. There were steamers, big and little, many of them towing queer, flat-bottomed kind of boats, lighters and barges, which on approaching nearer we could distinctly see were filled to their utmost capacity with men and horses. Both Ted and I stood staring at the unusual sight, wondering whatever it meant. They came on very quickly, however, so quickly indeed that we thought it best to move on. The biggest ships went along to Weybourne Gap, where they moored in the 25 feet of water that runs in close to the shore, while some smaller steamers and the flats were run up high and dry on the hard shingle. Before this, I noticed that there were quite a number of foreign warships in the offing, with several destroyers far away in the distance, both to east and west. From the larger steamships, all sorts of boats were lowered, including apparently many collapsible whale boats, and into these, in a most orderly manner, from every gangway and accommodation ladder, troops, Germans we afterwards discovered them to our utter astonishment, began to descend. So in the book, the Germans managed to land 38,000 men on the Norfolk coast, quite a number. And just 4 years later than the book is set, so in 1914, the Germans did in fact shell the east coast of England, including Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby. So a lot of these scares you see in literature and media like film do actually end up playing out to some degree in the First World War for real. Just going to go back to screen sharing. Now, there's some wonderful ephemera, which my friend Dr. Nicholas Hiley has very kindly allowed me to include. These are just two sets of items from his collection. So here we have a collection of documents just to prove how real this threat was. So you can see we have the Harwich Emergency Committee for what to do in case of invasion. Kingston upon Hull at the top from December 1914. So this is actually during World War One, and March 1916 on the left for East Suffolk. And another document that Nick has only just acquired, Norfolk based now. We have the Hunstanton Emergency Committee, and if you look down the bottom, this is from June 1917. And I'll just read the third paragraph. In case of an attempted invasion, warning will be given throughout the town, upon which all persons who intend to leave their homes should immediately get ready and supply themselves with the necessary warm clothes, blankets, etc., and enough provisions for about 2 days. So there's plenty of even surviving documentation of various preparations for this. Now, there were, I've mentioned the Zeppelin raids from 1915 on Norfolk, but the invasion scare started to ramp up in a big way in the middle of the war in 1916, and this was partly due to the stalemate on the Western Front. And in January 1916, the Admiralty and the War Office reckoned that the Germans might be able to land as many as 160,000 men, that's considerably more than in our current army, and that it would take at least 24 hours for the Royal Navy to intervene, by which time they might have landed a considerable number. In April 1916, Lowestoft was bombarded by the German Navy, and the population fled inland as far as Bungay. And in May 1916, the slightly indecisive Battle of Jutland just reinforced the fears that an invasion might be possible. And the General Staff decided they would need as many as 500,000 men to defend England. Now, I want to show you there's another fascinating piece of ephemera. I hope you can see this. This is called the Hun's Handbook, and this was published in 1915. It's a completely fictitious and very tongue-in-cheek document. The fiction is that it's been captured on a German prisoner of war. And it's really just a series of humorous cartoons of German invaders sort of making fools of themselves, trying to get to grips with the local population. But nonetheless, it's another fascinating reminder that this threat was perceived to be real and taken seriously. And I just want to give you one final piece of ephemera of the time. And I have to just move out of the way here. Just bear with me. I just need to change that. We have a prop. I'm going to play you a 78 record. I'll just play you a minute of this. I just hope you can see that. Yes, you can. So this is a 1915 78 called "The Germans Are Coming." I actually found this for £1 in a Holt in a car boot sale. But nonetheless, this is well, it's the only song I know of that commemorates the invasion threat. I'm afraid it's very worn, but it's the only copy I've ever found of it. So just give you the first minute of "The Germans Are Coming."
I've been on sentry go all day and all the night before, with a close throb in my head, in the yard I've had to stand. It's all through my old woman, she's thrown Barney on the war, with the bread knife on a broomstick, she's a standing at the door. And when I say the Germans can't get by the King's Navy, she says they've got such big feet, they can walk upon the sea. The Germans are coming, so they sing, so they say, but the Germans had better stop away, stop away. When they beat my Mrs. Liza, oh my, they'll have a big surprise. When they land the sauerkraut band, up will come my Mrs. and her boy. They may cross the seas as German sausages, but they'll go back beneath Avaloy.
Right, just get myself back. Right, hopefully you can see me again. Great. So, why was it we think of in the Second World War the invasion threat focusing primarily on the south coast, particularly in the Calais to Dover region? So, why was Norfolk, for example, seen to be potentially at risk of invasion? Well, the single best way I can explain it is by actually fast forwarding a few years. In 1928, a German professor called Ewald Bonz, I'm probably mispronouncing that, wrote a book which was then published in England 6 years later, probably to alert the public, called "Germany, Prepare for War." And this has a very interesting, I'll just go back into screen share. Right, this is a very clear example. So this is a map from Professor Bonz's book. And because in the First World War, the majority of the time, the Western Front is very roughly on the French-Belgian border, more or less, which meant they didn't have access to all the ports to hop across the south coast, which meant that, in fact, the invasion threat naturally focused on the East England coast more than on the south coast. So in Bonz's projected plan of 1928, as you can see, he's primarily suggesting Yarmouth to Dover as the natural place of attack, and he's even got a very interesting diversionary attack in the rear from Neutral Island, landing at Liverpool. So, but this nonetheless explains why the threat was from the east. To a small extent, the same was repeated early on in the Second World War, because until the fall of France, Norway was invaded before France. So in 1940, there was a very brief period of a few weeks where the east coast was seen to be more at risk than the south coast. And I'm going to give you a short quote of why Professor Bonz thinks that East Anglia was attractive to invasion. He says, "Norfolk and Suffolk, a relatively sparsely populated agricultural district. This region is so noticeably cut off from the rest of England, including even the southeast, by the Wash and the Fens, by the lower Thames, and by various other rivers, that it is necessarily of the greatest interest to any invading army. Now, the first lines of defence would have been obviously the Royal Navy, and we had various relatively lightweight gun batteries set up on the Norfolk coast during the First World War. And the batteries were at Salthouse, Cromer, Eccles, Hemsby, Caister, Yarmouth, and Galston. And there was mobile artillery at Weybourne and Munsley. Now, all this is relatively lightweight, and there are no remains surviving on the ground today, as far as I'm aware. And what's quite interesting is some of those locations were precisely the ones that had been defended in previous invasion scares, particularly in the Napoleonic era, and even some of them going back, in the case of Weybourne, to 1588. And before we start looking at the actual physical defences, I just have to give you a wonderful quote that was found by historian Frank Mears. It's written to a letter written to a girl at Sheringham Hall from a cousin of hers in the Admiralty. And the cousin writes, "Dear Laura, I don't think the Germans will come, but if they do, it's nothing to make a fuss about. You must take it all in a day's work." So let's start to look now at the actual defences on the ground. The first line of defence beyond the beaches themselves were trenches, obviously the most iconic image of the First World War. And trenches were dug around quite a lot of the Norfolk coast. There are no remains that I know, and sadly, there are no known pictures. We do have quite a few pictures surviving of the defences on the Isle of Sheppey, which is at the northeastern tip of Kent. So I'm going to show you those as the next best thing to what Norfolk would have had. So here we have a fairly standard First World War type of trench where you can walk along the lower bit without your head being over the parapet, and you step up onto the firing step on your right, which would allow you to fire your rifle over towards the enemy. So this is an actual trench built on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent. And here's another image of the same trench system. So related to their Western Front cousins, and something along these lines was built around most of the Norfolk coast. And there were other defences. There was this formidable looking armoured train. This was based at North Walsham. It's obviously fairly localised. It's only as relevant as the section of railway line it's based on, but nonetheless is an additional defence. And they also tried things like flooding the marshes at Salthouse, the idea being that would slow up invading troops. And very sadly, that did actually cause a fatality, and not against the enemy. There was a British soldier cycling along the coast one night after dark, and he came off his bicycle and fell into the flooded marsh and sadly drowned. So as far as I know, that's the only life actually claimed by the defences. So that's the background. Let's now get on to look at the pillboxes themselves. So this is an image of a fairly standard, we'll get onto the types in a moment, but the most common type looks like this. This particular one is at Aylmerton, which is just south of Sheringham in North Norfolk. So what is a pillbox? A pillbox is basically a small defensible position that would have been manned by perhaps 6 or so men, probably with rifles for this kind of pillbox. And the idea is it's like the trenches. It's a pre-prepared system. So you've got a defence system ready to man when the enemy invades. So you've sort of got an advanced position going. Why they're important is that they are the only physical reminder on the ground today of Norfolk's invasion threat. And really very little of what's left at all of the First World War on the home front. Now, first of all, why are they called pillboxes? Now, the name appears first, as far as is known, in the Times in August 1917, describing German defences during the Third Battle of Ypres. Now, I just need to come out of screen share. The origin of the name is disputed. It's usually thought that it is based on a box for pills, and Edwardian chemists sold boxes for pills in things very like this. This is tin, but the standard one was cardboard. And so it'll be this shape, so circular with a very slightly overhanging lid, which is important. And that's although this isn't a pillbox, it would have been cardboard, but that's very similar to the kind of thing that they're allegedly named after. The other theory, less popular, but it's conceivable that it's a corruption of pillar box, the idea that the slot that you put your letters in looks like the loophole that the gun would have been fired in. But most people favour the box for pills approach. And in Britain, pillboxes were built from certainly Yorkshire to Kent, at least, possibly further, but we know of examples between Yorkshire and Kent, towards the end of the war, from 1917 to 18, as a response to invasion fears hotting up in 1916, as I mentioned. So I just have to go back to my slideshow. Right. So when were they built and who built them? Well, there's an interesting archaeological answer to this. This is a close-up of a pillbox's loophole. The loophole is the window you would have fired your rifle through. And this is some fascinating graffiti on this. If you look carefully, on the left of the picture, I'm trying to circle it with my mouse. Hopefully you can see it says July. And on the right, it says 1918 AD, in case you were in any doubt. So July 1918. Now, this is extraordinary. Oh, and also RE, Royal Engineers, just above the date. So built by the Royal Engineers, July 1918. This is just a few months before the war ended. Now, why this is extraordinary is it shows how the invasion threat escalated through the war. In the Second World War, we have the opposite. The invasion fear escalates enormously from the fall of France on and starts to drop off from the time that Hitler turns on Russia in 1941. So the invasion threat is particularly the summer of 1940 and to a lesser extent into 1941. But this pillbox, built in July 1918, this is more or less the equivalent of having a World War II pillbox built in January 1945, which would have been unthinkable. The pillboxes in Britain were actively being abandoned around 1942 onwards. So this piece of luck that this graffiti survives and was found is a very interesting clue in the lack of much documentary evidence to support it. And these were not just built by professionals, the Royal Engineers, they would have been manned by professionals. I mentioned that they wanted to keep up to 500,000 men for home defence. This isn't Captain Mannering and co manning these defences. If needed, they would have been manned by professional soldiers. Now, sadly, we don't have many surviving pillboxes from the First World War in Norfolk. There are several hundred Second World War ones. The vast majority of pillboxes you see on the ground today are from the Second World War. I've, over 36 years, been able to find remains of 24 pillboxes in Norfolk. I've managed to find records from a variety of sources, which I'll come on to later, of 30 more. So I know of at least 54 that were made. I would imagine substantially more were made that I just don't know about. And again, we'll come on to that. So the wonderful thing about plotting these and recording them is you can start to build patterns. The huge danger is you tend to see an isolated pillbox from either war and go, what use would that have been? And that's because you're seeing a tiny little piece of the puzzle. So this map here, what I've done, any of the red blobs are pillboxes. Some of them survive today. Some of them are where I know exactly where they were originally. So there should be 54 blobs, hopefully. And this is very interesting because we can start to trace patterns. And there's two obvious patterns that you can see. The first is that there is a line, as you'd expect, along the coast. It starts at Stiffkey, just east of Wells. No one knows any remains west of Stiffkey, so I think we can assume there weren't any. There's a bit of a gap, but then you get Blakeney, Cley, Salthouse, Weybourne, Sheringham, Cromer. Now, interestingly then, the coastal line dies out after Cromer. There were a pair at Bacton, there's still one at Sea Palling, and there's some just inland of Yarmouth. I think it's overwhelmingly likely there would have been more along the coast. Munsley, for example, was heavily defended, not just in the Second World War, but in earlier conflicts too. So let's assume there were more along the coast. Now, you can also start to see, not only are there a few just south of Sheringham, a mile or two inland, so we're seeing the coastline and a backup line, but there's also the start of an inner line again, just north of Holt, and then the Aylmerton one that I just showed you, which I'm circling here. And then that goes down to Antingham here, Hanworth there, and then Antingham, and it goes along very meticulously along the line of the River Ant down to Wayford Bridge. Now, the thinking of if you go to the Upper Ant today above Dilham, there's virtually nothing to see. It's pretty much a water-filled ditch for the most part. But you have to remember, up until 1935, that was an active navigation. Wherries were trading up the Dilham North Walsham Canal as recently as 1935. And in fact, it was reused as a stop line in the Second World War. So the logic is, it's geographically perfect. It's a few miles inland from the coast, but almost exactly follows the arc of the coast. And a deep water-filled ditch will slow up invading troops, which means they ideally want to cross at the bridges. So if you defend the bridges, you've got a natural defensible position. So that's the advantage of the Upper Ant. Now, once you get below Wayford Bridge, there's only one other bridge on the Ant, which is at Ludham. And you'll notice there's a very big gap between Wayford Bridge and Great Yarmouth. And I think a lot of what I'm saying is conjectural, by the way, because there's so little original evidence to work from. But my theory is that the Broads, the Norfolk Broads, gave a natural, very wide and deep ditch. So, from an attacking army's point of view, you don't really want to be crossing the Bure at Stokesby, for example. So, I think it overwhelmingly likely there would have been defences at Ludden Bridge and Acle Bridge. There are no known remains. I found no documentary evidence of those, but I think we can assume there were once defences there. There would almost certainly have been pillboxes on the coast at Yarmouth. So we do still have a surviving pair just west of Yarmouth, and we'll see those in a minute, either side of the A47. There were a pair, they're no longer there, either side of Braden Water, a little further west again. And there is one that still survives at St Olives, the southernmost one. So the key thing to take away from this pattern is this sense of the coastline and a backup line, an inward line, roughly along the course of the River Ant. Now we're going to look, this is an original map. Now I'm very grateful to Chris Kolonko, who's a historian and archaeologist who unearthed this when he was working for Historic England. So this is a period map. And this shows, I wanted to show you my map first because it's easier to decipher. But if you look at the winding course of the Ant on the left, you have these various black blobs, and these are pillboxes. So these are the same ones I've just shown you on my modern map. But although I said there's no pillboxes known along most of the coast, there were a lot of other defences. All these red blobs are artillery pieces or various other, gun positions, supporting points, beach works, things like that. So there was very much a lot of defence work along the coast there. So let's now look at the actual types that were built. Now, let's look at, this is a First of all, pillbox in Belgium. This is at Hill 60. This is a rather unique one because it was actually originally a German one that the British captured and then converted into a British one. So this is a hybrid, but nonetheless, this is a very heavy-duty machine gun emplacement that is designed to be thick enough to withstand shelling, because all day, every day on the Western Front, you have enormous heavy artillery bombing these things. So any pillbox on the Western Front is built to incredibly high standards, several feet thick of, as you can see, reinforced concrete. There. Now, the ones we see in Norfolk are built much lighter, but you have to remember it's not like World War II where we were expecting the Germans to come over with panzers and 88mm artillery pieces and things like that. There would have been very large numbers of troops coming over, but not the same heavy artillery that you'd see on the Western Front. So Norfolk has very broadly three main distinct types. This is the first one. Now, I mentioned that the line begins at Stiffkey. So, sorry, although it's black and white, I shot this on film. This is a recent picture shot about 5 years ago. So this is a slightly uncharacteristic one. This is quite small, and this is one of the ones that most closely resembles our little Edwardian box for pills. This is built, so first of all, it's circular, and that's a very common feature of British First World War home front designs in East Anglia. You also see it's not made of poured concrete, it's made of large concrete blocks, which would have been precast elsewhere and brought to site and erected in situ. Now, in interest of fairness, I should say there is some difference of opinion over whether this is a First World War pillbox. I think it is. It's conceivable that it isn't. Just behind that line of trees is an anti-aircraft practice camp built in the late 1930s. And it's not impossible that this was used as a sort of observation post, say, to look at how successful the target practice was. The National Trust did restore this. It was a lot of the blocks were missing and out of place, and the National Trust restored it about 10 years ago. And the interesting thing is that the loopholes don't face towards the sea as you'd expect, but they face east-west along the coast. And some people have queried, therefore, if that means it isn't a pillbox. I don't think that means anything. You find that on Second World War designs, where they're actually designed to face along the beaches rather than just out to sea. And anyway, it's conceivable, although I don't think so, but it's conceivable the National Trust have reassembled it wrong. So we shouldn't read too much into that. There were Second World War spent bullet cases found in it when they cleaned it out. But all that means is they've used it for some sort of target practice in the next conflict. So this is probably a First World War pillbox. Now, there's a related type. Sorry for the slightly fuzzy picture, but it's no longer with us. I shot these in August 1992. This is one of a pair of pillboxes that I mentioned that was either side of Braden Water, just west of Yarmouth. And if I go to the second picture, you can very clearly see the overlapping roof of the pillbox, like in our Edwardian box for pills. Now, clearly, either the pillbox has sunk in the ground under its own weight over the years, or mud dredged up from Braden Water has been stacked up around it. It would probably have been around 6 or 7 feet above the ground when it was built. And so I say I shot this in August 1992. By the late 90s, it was gone. I think almost certainly it's still there and just dredging work has piled up on top of it. So theoretically, it ought to be possible to excavate that in the future. Now let's look at another type. Now this is a picture back on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent, only because that's all we've got for pictures of the correct time. And here we have something that looks much more like a Second World War pillbox. It's made of poured concrete, it's hexagonal, it's for machine guns. And it isn't, it's actually a First World War pillbox. And they built a few at Sheppey, one of which survives. And this has a relative in Norfolk, which we'll look at now. So there were 3 of these surviving in Norfolk. This is one of the pair just west of Yarmouth, either side of the A47. And as you can see, this, unlike our one at Stiffkey, this is made of poured concrete, almost certainly using timber shuttering. And it has 2 design features which jump out at us. Most people take this for a Second World War one because it's so like one of the most commonly found designs in Norfolk, the Type 22, which is a regular hexagonal type. But 2 design features jump out, well, 3 actually. First of all, the majority of the Second World War ones used in Norfolk used brick rather than timber to pour the concrete into, and they left the brick behind. So most Second World War Norfolk ones look wrongly like they're made of brick. They're not. They're concrete within the brick. But the First World War ones are just concrete. And you can see on the left there are some steel doors, which I'll show you better in a minute. And to the right, there's a loophole at an unusual level. Let's get a better look at that. Now, just come a few feet round to the right here. And as you can see, we have these 2 loopholes at wildly different heights. Very roughly, the one on the left, you would stand up to shoot through, and the one on the right, you would kneel down to shoot through. I'm not entirely sure what the advantage of that is. You're protected from bullets anyway. That's the whole idea of being in a pillbox, that you're protected from enemy fire. So I don't particularly see the advantage of crouching down, but nonetheless, it's not found on all First of all pillboxes, but probably 2/3 or so have this feature. And wonderfully, we get another thing about this picture. If you look to the left, you'll see it has a twin in the field the other side of the road there, completely identical. So this is a superb pair. These are 2 of the only 3 surviving hexagonal pillboxes in Norfolk from the First World War. The third is St Olives, but it's been very heavily modified. And pairs turn up for First World War pillboxes in Norfolk so commonly that if you find a lone one, three-quarters of the time, if you poke around in the bushes within about a 200-yard radius, you'll often find its missing twin. Now, this is a close-up of the steel doors. Almost all of Norfolk's types had these originally. Quite often, they've been ripped out post-war for scrap. So you occasionally find these pillboxes with vast holes where they've had to resort to quite heavy-handed techniques to rip them out. But this pair at Yarmouth still have them. They're thick enough to be, I think, bulletproof. And interestingly, they can be locked from either side. So we're outside for this picture. And the idea is you could padlock it and let's say, leave ammunition or rifles or whatever inside to be ready. You can also, of course, perhaps more importantly, you can also bar them with a very thick bar from the inside to stop the enemy prizing the doors open. Now, sadly, inside, this pair isn't quite as well preserved. It's rather crude looking inside. You can clearly see the timber marks where they've put wood in place to pour the concrete into. And you'll see those weird those sort of rusty streak marks under the loopholes. Now, then we'll get onto those in a minute because there's some features being removed from this one that we'll see elsewhere. Now, the next type is this. This is the quintessential Norfolk type, by far the most commonly found, and it looks nothing like its Second World War descendants. So we're circular again. This is slightly larger than the type we saw at Stiffkey and at Braden Water. It doesn't have the overhanging roof. And like at Stiffkey and Braden Water, it's built of these concrete blocks, rather like an igloo is built. Now, the advantages are you can cast the concrete blocks elsewhere and just bring them in situ. You don't need to erect shuttering and pour concrete in. And there's another design advantage, which is potentially enemy bullets are more likely to bounce off a circular wall rather than hitting straight onto a straight line of, let's say, a hexagonal or a square type. So this is the most common type that we find in Norfolk today. I'm going to show you, this is a plan of a slightly atypical one at Sea Palling, but it just gives you the idea. So on the Sea Palling example, all the loopholes are at the same height. And if you look at the plan in the middle, you'll see four circular holes, and I'll explain those in a minute. And this is very roughly, it's a fraction over 10 feet in diameter. Now, the walls are only about a foot thick. Certainly in World War II, it was thought you needed 18 inches of reinforced concrete to be thought to be bulletproof. But anyway, they presumably thought it was enough in the First World War. So this is another example of the same type. This is at Hanworth, so just off the very top of the line along the River Ant. Now, this is an odd one because it doesn't seem to have sunk into the ground noticeably, maybe a few inches. And here we have this weird feature of the loopholes on this picture being all absolutely at ground level. They might have been a foot higher or so originally, but not much. I have to say I've no idea what advantage that gives you over just firing out of a trench, really. But nonetheless, it is what it is, and it's just another example of the circular type. And we're now back to the one I showed you a minute ago. So this is at Whitehorse Common, just northeast of North Walsham on the River Ant line. The River Ant is a few hundred yards off to the right of the picture down a slope that leads you down to the Ant navigation. And again, I love this picture just because you get this sense of them as a line of defences. And this is the crucial thing when you see a lone pillbox. It's not a lone pillbox, it's part of a defensible line and related to the trench mentality of the First World War. Now, let's go inside. So this is one of the two at Whitehorse Common near North Walsham. And you can see two loopholes. These are to be fired through when standing up. And you can see the doors are in situ in this example, and they're open. And another example, this is the one I showed earlier at Aylmerton, just south of Sheringham. And this is the different loophole heights from the inside. The one on the right you'd stand up to use. The one on the left is weird. It's too high up to be kneeling down for, so you'd have to sort of stoop to use it, which baffles me, but it is what it is. Now here we get a very interesting design feature. This is missing from a lot of them, and this is why there were those weird streak marks in the ones at Yarmouth. Originally, the loopholes of most of these designs had quite a lot of ironware around them. This is to have a vertically sliding steel shutter that can close off the loophole. So you have this circular hoop that you can hook onto that sort of nail sticking out of the wall. And the idea of that is if you want to use the loophole and fire against the enemy, you pull up the shutter and you hook it in place and you fire your rifle through. The mounting just below the loophole would, I imagine, have been for some sort of cradle, some sort of support for your rifle. And so the same loophole, this is what it looks like in the locked position. So let's say you might have 6 men in the pillbox, but unless you're surrounded, you don't necessarily want to be firing through all 6 loopholes. You might only want to be firing through 2. So you can close off the ones you don't want to use by this vertically sliding steel shutter. And as I say, these are often missing where people have recycled them for scrap after the war. And that's the same loophole seen from the outside, so closed down so enemy bullets can't get in. Now, there is a particular reason this feature is so important. First World War pillboxes in Norfolk do not have interior walls. If you've ever been inside a standard hexagonal Second World War Norfolk pillbox, you'll know that there's an interior wall almost always shaped like a capital Y. It's called a blast and anti-ricochet wall. And the reason for that is if an enemy bullet gets in through one of the loopholes, it can bounce around the walls inside and kill everyone inside. So if you have an internal wall, it minimises that. Because the First World War pillboxes don't have the interior walls, the steel shutters are really important to keep out unwanted enemy bullets. Now, I mentioned the holes in the roof on that plan. This is an example of one, and almost all of Norfolk's First World War pillboxes have these equally spaced holes. Now, there is a theory which I don't subscribe to, which is that the reason for the holes is that the roofs maybe were cast in situ, sorry, not in situ, right next to the pillbox, and would have been craned into position using the holes in the roof. I think that's unlikely. I think infinitely more likely they're ventilation holes, because if you imagine you've got perhaps 4 of the 6 loopholes shuttered, and you've obviously barricaded the doors from the inside, there's no air coming in, and you've got 6 men needing oxygen. Also, you need the smoke from the guns to be able to get out. So I think almost for certain these holes are ventilation holes. They're too small for an enemy grenade to be able to get down remotely plausibly. So, and I think they're calibrated with that in mind to be the optimum size for ventilation, but not for the occupants is. Now at Spa Common, that's another one just northeast of North Walsham, we get this one. Now this is one of a pair at the site, both of which are unique. Now this one looks like it's the standard circular concrete block type, but in fact, it's actually shaped like a capital D with the bulge of the D's on the left of the picture. Now, I'm actually standing on the crossing point of the River Ant there, and we're facing east. Now, this is rather interesting because you would logically put the pillboxes they normally do on the landward side of the river because you want to use the wrong side, keep bending the road on the seaward side of the road of the river, sorry. And by building it in this unusual shape, they managed to get not one but three gun positions right next to each other, all facing up the road. So they've effectively done a one-off modification that's allowed them to triple their firepower to shoot up the road with the enemy coming down it. So that's the logic. And a last little piece of detailing I have to show you. Now, apologies for the picture quality. I shot this in 1995 and you can't shoot this anymore. I've been back. So this is the other hexagonal one that survived. This is at St. Olives. And there's a beautiful piece of, I don't know if it's camouflage or more likely First World War humour. If you look just to the left of the loophole, you get a plaque saying St. Olives Hall. And I say maybe it was part of a very elaborate camouflage scheme. I think it's probably just a cute piece of humour that must have been knocked up by one of the people who either built it or might have manned it. It's still in place, that plaque, but it's long since been painted over. So I'm afraid I couldn't go back to get a high resolution image of it. So those are an overview of the different designs in Norfolk. And what happened next? So, as you probably know, they were never used. The Germans never invaded. And they were completely forgotten. There appears to be, I found hardly any mention of these anywhere. They seem to be, the invasion threat of the First World War was forgotten, and the anti-invasion defences and preparations were completely forgotten. And of course, just 21 years later, World War II started. Now, before that, I've only found anywhere a single mention of any of East Anglia's pillbox. Dennis Wheatley wrote a novel in 1934 called Black August, which is set in Shingle Street in Suffolk. And there are circular First World War pillboxes at Shingle Street in Suffolk, and the hero takes refuge in a pillbox at one point. But that's the only mention I've ever found of them. So, World War II. What happens is, much earlier than is genuinely thought, because the pillbox building program doesn't take off until just before the fall of France in the summer of 1940. But fascinatingly, in December 1939, the military surveyed the pillboxes on the North Norfolk coast just in case they were any use in anti-invasion preparations of World War II. And this is an extraordinary document that exists in the National Archives at Kew in West London. And I don't know if they surveyed other places. I've only ever found a survey of a particularly small section of North Norfolk. They went around logging every single pillbox they could find or knew about, and they assessed the condition and the designs. Let's just at random take site number 4, and it's we see that it has 6 loopholes. Which are quite wide, and everything is the shutters are good and well fitting, and that it's circular, 10-foot wide, camouflaged with bracken. This pillbox has recently been cleaned out and is in excellent condition. This is 21 to 22 years after it was built. And we also find that it has glass cemented into the loopholes. So I think that's a local adapting it for, I don't know, a garden shed or something in peacetime, but now roughly broken away. So it's the fascinating thing is therefore they were thinking of using these in the next conflict. And so this, sorry, beg your pardon. So did they use any in the Second World War in practice, having surveyed them? Well, let's look at another piece of documentary evidence. Now, this is nothing to do with the First World War. This is Weybourne area. So to the left of the picture, you have Salthouse. To the right, Weybourne. In the middle, Kelling. Now, this is part of the anti-invasion defences in the Weybourne area from 1940-41. And this again exists in the National Archives at Kew. And all the red dots are pillboxes. And a lot of these are still there today. Now, if you look in the middle bottom, I'm circling it with my mouse, I'm hoping you can see it. There, we get number 210. Now, that's a World War II pillbox. Just above and to the right of it, this one, number 203. Let's have a look at that. That's still there today. It's completely buried in a field boundary, but it still exists. Let's go and have a look at it. I'll show you a picture. That's number 203. Well, that's very clearly a circular First World War design. So why that's so interesting is it proves that this was officially included in the Second World War schemes. They could have either just abandoned it, or they might have demolished it and built a heavier duty pillbox. But they decided, for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, that was good enough, and they would include it in the defence scheme. So that's a known example where it was used. I say used, I don't mean used in practice, but incorporated into the official defence schemes. Let's go a little along the coast to West Runton, just west of Cromer. Now, this looks like a rather unusual Second World War type. That loophole that's been blocked up is clearly for a heavy machine gun, probably a Vickers. But incredibly, that is actually another circular First World War pillbox inside all that. I don't know why they didn't just demolish it and start again. I would have thought it was easier, but maybe not. So they've filled all but one of the loopholes, and they've enormously enlarged that loophole. And this inches wide, which is regarded as shell-proof, and unusually is just a single loophole. So that's another example of a First World War one. They've just taken it and just repurposed it in the next conflict. And let's now look in more detail. This is a map of a section of the River Ant line. Now, just if you have a look at the key on the right, the hollow red circles are First World War pillboxes, and the solid red circles are Second World War pillboxes. So let's work north to south. The top one is Little London, and that's a pair of First World War pillboxes, and there's a Second World War trench, not marked, and a Second World War pillbox. And in fact, that pair at the top are amongst the ones that have been listed recently. So now those First World War pillboxes are slightly in the way of the Second World War pillboxes sightlines. So I believe they were probably incorporated, like our example at Kelling, into the Second World War defence schemes. Just south, this is the pair at Spa Common. The one on the right is the weird D-shaped one. Now, there are no known Second World War defences there. So they either, for some weird reason, decided not to defend that crossing, or more likely decided the First World War ones were good enough. Then if we carry on down, this is now Whitehorse Common that we saw earlier. This one's a bit of an ambiguous one. There are two Second World War pillboxes there, but because they're lower down the slope and they're on the enemy side, it's conceivable they just ignored the First World War ones. They weren't in the way. They might have used them and they had four pillboxes. I suspect they just quietly abandoned them. The next set, we get Brigade on the left and Honing on the right. None of those four pillboxes from the First World War survive. And I can't prove it, it's conjecture. I think almost certainly they demolished the First World War pillboxes when building their 1940-41 replacements to clear the sight lines. I think they decided they weren't heavy duty enough, or maybe they were in unsound condition, and rather than having them getting in the way of the firing lines, they demolished them, probably. And then at Wayford Bridge, there's one that survives to the right, there's another one that's long gone. I don't know if they reused the one that survives and demolished the other one. I don't know. And you get three Second World War pillboxes on the left. So this shows us two things. It shows the very same sites being redefended just 21 years later. And in some cases, the First World War defence is being recycled, and in some of them being actively demolished. So I mentioned in total, I know 54 of these in Norfolk, these First World War pillboxes, of which we have 24 known survivors. So what's my sources? How do I know about these? Well, some of them are easy. You can drive around and look for them and find them in many cases. And in the case of things like the River Ant lines, you literally go to each crossing point of the Ant, and probably 2/3 of the time, if you look around, you can find them. And some have been demolished even in the times I've been recording them, like the one at Braden that's now buried. And there's one near Bacton that I recorded in 1990 and was demolished, I think, by 1992. But of course, there were a great many before that. So the 1939 War Office survey was invaluable. That added quite a lot of sites I didn't know about. Some I know from quite chance documentary evidence. So a few years ago, my wife and I used to stay in a cottage we rented at Kelling. And this fascinating map was hanging up there. And I had a look at that one morning, and I realised halfway between Kelling and Holt, towards the bottom of the picture, you see there's a triangle here. And you see there's a pillbox marked in that triangle. Now, this is, I should say, is an interwar map, so we know it's not World War II. And there are no remains on the ground now. I have checked in the winter. There were Second World War gun positions just to the right of it, and I can only guess, unless it got hit by a motorist or something, I think it was being demolished in building the World War II defences to give them a much clearer firing line against the enemy coming in. So that's another source. Some sources I've been able to get from aerial photography. Now, Chris Kolonko brilliantly supplied this a few years ago. This is an image at West Runton. So, just to navigate you, the West Runton Church is just off to the left of the picture, and the circular one we saw converted a few minutes ago is just off to the top left of the picture. And this is an aerial photograph from the 20s, I think. And unmistakably, we have a First World War circular pillbox with the low entrance and loopholes at different heights that Chris found on this aerial photograph. I don't doubt there will be others yet to be found on aerial photographs. I mean, all these things we're just scratching the surface of, but that the only source of that is that picture that Chris found. And I'm just going to take as a case study one particular site. Let's look at a place called Pretty Corner, which is just south of Sheringham. This is Pretty Corner. These days it's much more overgrown, but in the period of the First World War and just following it was a famous sort of picnicking spot. Now, in the 1939 survey, there are no defences listed at Pretty Corner, so I had no reason to suspect there'd be anything there. But I found the postcard you're looking at now on eBay a few years ago. Now, keep that signpost that's in the bottom right in mind, because that navigates you through the next few pictures. Now, the reason this postcard is interesting is what's written on the back. So it seems to have been written by a soldier, and he says, "We often pass here on a march, and just above the signpost are several German pillboxes." Now, he's mistaken. They're very definitely not German pillboxes. They're anti-German pillboxes. But how interesting. There's none shown on the picture, and I had no evidence from any of my other sources that there were any defences there. And why would there have been defences there? And then I realised, well, it's part of that secondary line, just a few miles in inland, like the one long lost at Bodham, like the one at Aylmerton, that then joins onto the line at Hanworth and onto Antingham. So I carried on scouring eBay and I bought this postcard. It's not dated, but that's the same signpost we saw on the previous postcard. And we see this rather interesting circular fragment at the middle, in the middle at the bottom. Now, just judging from the sort of radius of that piece of concrete, I would say that's a piece of concrete of roughly 10 feet or so in diameter. That, to me, is the foundations of a First World War circular pillbox. And finally, I found proof, and I'm afraid I cheated. I never found this for real. I stole this out of a book some years later. Here is, I'm afraid, a very poor quality scan of the two long lost pillboxes at Pretty Corner, Sheringham, with that exact same signpost. And I think the reason that they're there in the First World War and they disappeared by the 1939 survey, because it was the beauty spot, I think they were demolished straight away after the First World War. Whereas someone like Spa Common or Whitehorse Common, which are more industrial areas with mills, they weren't priority for demolition. So I think, apart from those postcards, there's no evidence for those. And I say, I can't stress enough, I don't doubt there will be probably dozens more that I don't know about. Now, what's happened recently is a fabulous thing, which is Chris Kolonko, who I've mentioned a couple of times, who worked for Historic England, managed to get some of them listed. And this is one of the 8 that he's managed to get listed. And this is at Bradfield, which is the very top of the River Ant stop line. This is one of a pair there, both of which are listed, and you can actually see the yellow sign informing people of the fact on the left. So that's terrific. And so the mood has started to turn in their favour, and this even made the national news. However, it's not all good news. Unfortunately, this particular one we're looking at here has quite a damp problem because the doors are shut and it's very mildewy and damp area. It's very overhung with trees. It has a huge amount of damp inside, and I don't know whether that's going to be a structural problem longer term or not. Some of them are starting to succumb, sadly. I suppose after 110 years, it's to be expected. I don't even know if you remember, I showed you one earlier at Hanworth, the one that had the very low loopholes right at ground level. I'm now going to show you another image of Hanworth. Now, this is a baffling picture. I'm sorry it's a bit overgrown. I did shoot it in December to give you as little vegetation as possible. For reasons that escape me, it's been cut completely in half. So you can see the loopholes poking through at ground level. I've no idea why it's cut in half. It's some way off the A140, so it's not for road widening purposes. But I can't imagine structurally that's going to be very good for it. And I would have thought the roof will cave in at some point. So I would have thought that's a priority that somehow needs to be stabilised. And also, you may remember earlier I showed you a picture of a close-up of a loophole of the pillbox at Sea Palling that showed us that it was built in July 1918. Now, this is that pillbox in July 1997, and I went back to this in last month to try and get a better modern digital picture of that graffiti for this talk. And I drove right past the pillbox, couldn't find it. And I thought, oh, damn, God, it's been demolished. What a terrible tragedy. And I drove up and down a couple more times, and finally I found it's there. It's just that's what it looks like now. Absolutely overgrown with ivy. And if we go inside, we see this rather tragic sight. You see the ivy, it's not just a case of prying it off, it's absolutely taken over the entire pillbox. And I did wonder about prying it off to try and take a picture of the graffiti because I know where it is. But I realized, fortunately, in time, no, that's a job for a professional conservator because it will rip off the cement if I pull that off. So that's a pillbox I'd love to see saved and stabilized, but that's a skilled job for someone who isn't me to do. So I think there is still a fair amount done. I'm hoping more can be listed. I'm obviously hoping it's possible that local enthusiasts may do more. That listed one at Bradfield I showed you was actually cleaned out and restored about 10 years ago by a friend of mine, Ian Clark, who was just a local man who took it on to save. And really, just a couple of things to end with, really. I just want to show you a couple of finds. Let's go back to the 1939 survey one more time. Now, site number 8 is rather interesting. According to this, it's a rectangular pillbox, and they've even done a little sketch of it on the right, and it's huge. It's 24 feet long. Now, the standard circular First World War pillbox in Norfolk is around 10 feet, or just over 10. And so this is more than twice the size. It's quite narrow, but it's very, very long. And there are a few square pillboxes listed in this document, all at Salthouse, all of them long gone. I've walked that beach dozens of times. But the amazing thing about the North Norfolk coast, the sea's constantly turning it over, and sometimes it conceals defences I've known for years, and sometimes it scours the shingle and reveals defences I've never seen. And literally just this summer, and the great thing is I know where this is because you can plot the grid reference on the left, which is a wartime grid reference, but there are ways of converting it to the modern system. So I knew probably to within 100 yards or so where this pillbox once was. And I was walking with my wife on the beach, and at the exact right spot, I saw some concrete. And there are no known Second World War sites, which I've also recorded at that site. So I think, I can't prove, but I'm pretty certain this is the remains of the foundations of one tip. And there's a slight curve. You can't really make it out from this picture, but there's slight curving of the concrete, exactly consistent with that little 1939 sketch. So I think this is a recently revealed fragment of this unique 24-foot pillbox at Salthouse, just recently uncovered, and it may well be buried by the shingle again any moment. And I'd really just like to end this. This is just along the coast. This is an example on the Muckleborough Collection's land at Weybourne with a quote from philosopher Roger Scruton. He says, "We do not merely study the past, we inherit it. And inheritance brings with it not only the rights of ownership, but the duties of trusteeship. Things fought for and died for should not be idly squandered, for they are the property of others who are not yet born." So I think, although we only have 24 of these, I think they're fantastically important. They're the only physical reminder of an event virtually nobody knows about. And they are still under threat. And I say we have lost a couple even in the years I've recorded them. And I think the fact that 8 of them have now been listed is a fantastic step forward, but there's still a lot to do. Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to take any questions that anyone's got.
Right. Thank you very, very much, Christopher. I'm just trying to get my face in view.
You're back. Okay. You're back.
That was absolutely fascinating. And it's a strange sort of little lacuna in history, isn't it? Somehow?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How many did you say? 24?
24, and there were at least 30 more, but probably more.
Yeah. Yes. It's also a specialist interest, I think, and I think we may have several people here who share your interest and who will have questions to ask. So please, can we have any questions? Can people hear me? Yes, yes.
Looks like Adrian has a question.
Good. Thank you, Adrian.
Just, achieved, allowed to unmute. Christopher, several things emerged really in your. Sorry for the terrible lighting.
All right.
Emerged in your photographs. One of the, well, that earliest one with the graffiti on, the July 1918 one. Looking at the blocks and the graffiti, I mean, it is concrete still, is it? Because
Well,
the
it's
graffiti is rather exceptional in concrete.
yes. So it because you do find this, you find quite a lot of graffiti from the Second World War done in anti-tank blocks, which are just lumps of concrete, and as it's set, sometimes the builders have scrawled their names in it. So you're absolutely right. It is precast concrete blocks, but they have cement to sort of grout them together. And I think they've just smeared a bit of cement in order to be
That's
able to
given
draw.
them a surface to cut, because
Exactly.
it let a cut, in fact, wasn't
Yes,
it?
that's right. And they used some
Those
kind
are
of implement.
serif letters.
Yes, yes,
Yeah, okay, interesting. There was another one, the pair that was either side of a road. I think it was Braden Water, possibly.
yes.
It showed it was in there was an upper and a lower. You know, it was two pours of concrete, two seasonal pours.
That's right.
The lower half was a much better.
There's one thing to come back the
Yes.
next day for the next set, but sometimes it may be to do, maybe there was a frost or something like that, and it's actually shattered across the line between the pourings. Presumably not in 1940.
No, no,
Presumably it was
no.
good enough at the time.
Yes,
But yes, because it would have been built over,
yes.
certainly multiple days. So you're absolutely right. Yes.
You showed a sketch or a measured diagram of a
Yes.
circular pillbox. The embrasures were reversed. They were wide on the interior, narrow on the outside.
Yes. Now that's an interesting feature, which I'm slightly surprised is not more common on Second World War examples, because you need to be able to alter your firing position if you're holding a rifle. But the advantage of having the splay on the inside is it's harder for an enemy bullet to get in. And the danger if you have the splay on the outside is an enemy bullet can hit it and just be channeled into the pillbox. So
Yes.
actually it is, and in fact you sometimes find a modification on the Second World War type where instead of just being on a sort of 45-degree angle, it's stepped, sort of staircased to try and stop the bullet just being channeled inside.
But I'm not sure we came across one of those in your photographs that the interior was actually like
Well,
that.
annoyingly, that sketch, which was done in the early 1980s, was done on the sea Pauling one, which is slightly different from the standard kind. A lot of them have minute variations. There's no two that are literally identical. You
Yes.
get variations on exactly where the loopholes are placed or the height. So there's normally some tiny unique feature of each one. And the sea Pauling one has subtly different finish as well, if you look at my older photographs. So my theory is that may be one of the last built. I suspect most of them are from 1917, and the sea Pauling one is a bit of an outlier. And they may have tweaked the design a bit by the time that's built. I can't prove any of that. That's just conjecture.
I mean, obviously that reversed embrasure one gave you a very narrow firing line.
No, not necessarily, because as long as it's splayed on the inside, you probably still get the same.
Okay.
I would have thought.
For peripheral vision.
Yeah, yeah, no, you're right. You do suffer from that. That's true. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Before
Abe. Okay.
before Jess comes in with the questions that have been written in, can I ask why you think the River Ant was so very well protected,
So
particularly?
I think because in the Second World War they used multiple rivers as defence lines, and there were actually a whole series of progressive lines going inside. Whereas in the First World War they really just had this sort of one line. I think it's just because if you were wanting to dig it from scratch, it's perfect. It's just the right distance in from the coast, so you've got it as a secondary line distinct from the first one, and it not exactly, but very closely mirrors the position of the coast. If you think of the Ant not as it's navigable on a pleasure boat today, but of it going all the way up to North Walsham, it really gives you a sort of perfect, I don't know what, 5-ish miles inland from the coast, something like that. And it almost exactly mirrors the shape of the coast. So it's a sort of God-given defensible position. And where possible, they would take advantage, in the Second World War hugely so, of saving work by using, let's say, the River Thames as a stop line, for example, because it's already there. You can dig an anti-tank ditch from scratch, but it's a heck of a lot easier to use natural hills, things like that. Now, Norfolk, of course, is not particularly advantageous in terms of natural hills and valleys. So anything like a river is exactly what you want if you're wanting to defend the landscape. Elsewhere, you'd find them taking advantage of things like hills and gaps. Let's say at Dorking Gap in Surrey, you have to defend that because you're using the North Downs Ridge as a defensible position. But Norfolk gives you very little, but it does give you plenty of rivers. And so the important thing is it's in the right place, but you must defend the crossing points on it, because although from a boating perspective, there's Wayford Bridge and there's Ludden Bridge. But in the Ant navigation era, which was in use at the time of the First World War, there are a great number of bridges further up. So you've got to defend all of those. Whereas if you think of something like, let's say, the Bure and the Wensum, they're more horizontal than they are. They're not quite. You can sort of just go around them. They're not quite as advantageous. If you wanted to just build the stop line a few miles in from the coast, the Ant's already there. You can just use that. I think is the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we've got some questions in the chat. I'm keeping my video off because I've got an unstable internet connection at the moment. Moira Coleman asks, is there any evidence from Google Earth images or LiDAR surveys to reveal other sites?
Well, now that's very interesting. The answer is not that I know, but that's so. Well, Google Earth I have used. I've not found anything, and I have sort of scoured certain areas where I've suspected them. I've not found anything on Google Earth for these. Bear in mind, the problem is it's a 10-foot wide, 10-foot diameter circular building for the most part, usually overgrown. And just for example, those ones either side of the A47 at Yarmouth have earth camouflage on the roof, which may well be that they were reused in the Second World War. So if they've got earth camouflage on the roof, they're even harder to spot from Google Earth. So it's not impossible, but I haven't had much luck with that. LiDAR is a very interesting idea. That's sort of outside my field of expertise, but it's exactly the sort of thing that I hope other researchers who are more knowledgeable in that area would be able to. I mean, I guess this is what I'm saying. There's still so much that can be done and so much to uncover by scouring more documents in the National Archives. More might turn up. Looking at more old postcards, more may turn up. That was really luck that I found those pretty corner ones. There are all these different levels, and LiDAR's a brilliant idea. There are all these different levels where different researchers with different areas of expertise can hopefully still uncover more.
Great. And then Fiona asks, please can you reference the last quote again? Who was
yes.
the quote by?
I'm afraid I don't know where it's written, but it's from philosopher Roger Scruton. But I'm afraid I don't know which of his books it's from. I can't tell you that. I wrote it down years ago, and I'm afraid I didn't reference where it's from. But it's Roger Scruton, who's a philosopher.
Thank you. And Simon Wood asks, would the blocks have been cast locally or mass produced at a central manufacturing site to a common design?
Right. The honest truth is I haven't the faintest idea. A couple of thoughts. They are found quite wide in Norfolk. It could easily have been cast. I suppose it's not illogical. They would have been cast something like North Walsham, where there's quite a lot of industry. Just for comparison, there was, for example, hang on, I'll just show you this. This is sorry, take it out of this packet. This is a stereoscope image of a pillbox, just trying to get the reflection of it, on the Western Front. And this is built of precast concrete blocks. And these were built, although it's erected in Flanders, they were all made at a factory in, I think, Richborough in Kent, and designed potentially for use both on the home front, although we're not sure if they were used here, but they were certainly cast in Richborough and shipped off to the Western Front. So that being the case, they aren't necessarily made in Norfolk, these blocks. If they were casting stuff, not even in France, to go to the Western Front, it's perfectly possible those concrete blocks could have been cast somewhere else. But they may have been local in North Walsham. But I'm afraid I have no idea. Is the annoying but honest answer.
And
brought in at the River Ant.
Oh
yes, absolutely, yes.
And then following on from that, Ian says, if the blocks were cast centrally, Do you think the assembly was left to local fitters? He thinks maybe this could explain the differences in details.
Well, you find that a lot in the Second World War because Second World War defences, some are built by the Royal Engineers, but a huge amount are built by individual contractors to wildly different standards. So you find some Second World War ones that are superbly built and are still in stunning condition, and others that are quite sloppy and they've obviously used slightly dodgy concrete mix and all sorts of corners being cut, either out of shoddiness or out of desperation. And bear in mind, the only evidence I've ever found is that one at Sea Pauling that we know for a fact was built by the Royal Engineers. I think it more likely than not that most or all were built by the Royal Engineers. The whole difference in World War II, they were building so many, I mean, tens of thousands, that the only way to do it was to involve local contractors. The First World War ones, even though we don't know for a fact how many were not built in anything like the same quantities. So I think it overwhelmingly likely they're built by the Royal Engineers. But bear in mind, they're not all built at the same time. I mean, we were just talking, Adrian's point a minute ago, the design differences of the Sea Pauling example, and there are a few other different design details on that. It's possible that July 1918 is a bit of an outlier, and most of them may have been built a year and a half before that. So it's perfectly possible that the same engineers have come and just tweaked the design a bit. The honest truth is we don't know. I've never actually been through the Royal Engineers documents. I have been through the list of the file names to see if there was anything obviously of interest, and sadly there wasn't. I will someday go to the Royal Engineers archives just to make sure, but there isn't obviously a file on building East Anglian pillboxes, so I don't think there's anything there. So who knows though, because for years it was thought there was no documentation about World War II's defences. And there's an absolutely enormous amount of paperwork in the National Archives and elsewhere of Second World War defence building. Huge amount that even now has scarcely been scratched because there's just such a huge volume to get through. So I'd be delighted if more turns up. And there's certainly plenty of ephemeral things turning up, like the postcards and so on. And it's perfectly possible one day we'll know more. All I know is I've never found anything. So at the moment, I know no more, I'm afraid, on that. Sorry.
Thank you. And Ian also says it's not surprising that there is a gap between Sea Pauling and Yarmouth, given the rapid coastal erosion there, including several villages and churches since Victorian times.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the worst I've seen actually is on the Suffolk coast at Broadsea, which I first went to, I think, about 1993. It was incredible. Even in 1993, you had three eras of defences. You had two Martello towers from the Napoleonic threat, three, I think, First World War pillboxes, and a magnificently preserved Second World War gun battery. And I was last there about 10 years ago, and most of it had gone. All of the First World War stuff was gone. Everything on the beach that was there in the 90s was gone 15 years later, completely destroyed. And so, you're absolutely right. I think it's a combination. Some of the stuff on the coast will have been cleared when the Second World War defences were built, and many will have fallen into the sea. That said, I mean, there's quite a lot surviving from the Second World War along there, and I know, it's a 20+ year gap, but there's still a reasonable amount of Second World War material there. So I think it's a combination of, but then again, we don't know for a fact what was there. I'm surmising it would be very unlikely if there weren't pillboxes there, but I could be wrong about that. But you're right. If there were, then the erosion there, as you say, is I mean, Haysborough and Hemsby, makes national news. So absolutely.
Yeah. And then Adrian says, listing, presumably those listed are in good condition, represent several varieties, and are referred to as part of the defence line. So they're a group like the famous chain of PB at Christchurch, Hampshire.
I'm so sorry, Jess. What was the second part about Christchurch?
So
sorry?
he's just sort of saying that listing of those first. Well, maybe Adrian, do you want to come off mute and explain your question? Is it letting you do it? Bear with me. There we
go. Yes, I was only reflecting on the fact that I think the first pillboxes, Second War pillboxes that were listed ever must have been about the mid 1980s or late 80s, when suddenly a chain of about 20 pillboxes east of Christchurch, now in Dorset, but then Hampshire, was listed. And so there was a kind of group value all of its own. And I was just asking in terms of what's been done in North Norfolk, you know, are they represented as a group and referred to as the Ant Valley chain or something or other?
Yes, well, so the short answer is yes, and basically, so it's most but not all of the ones on the River Ant line, excuse me, have been listed, and so that's very much the idea that this is a group, and that's the advantage of them, because this is the great problem you see. Because I've always thought, for example, from the Second World War, there's a whole cluster that survive on the Muckleborough Collections land, and that's unique because it gives you a snapshot of quite how heavily defended these areas were, as opposed to where a farmer might have demolished one, some have gone into the sea. And so the idea that there's a whole group is hugely important. So the short answer is yes. Now that's a slightly poison chalice, because the flip side of that is, well, A, there are some on the outline that haven't been listed yet. I know there are moves afoot to try and get more preserved, because I mean, my point is there are 24 survivors, a third of them are preserved only as of a few months ago. I mean, this is very recent, this has happened. It would be great if all of them can be listed. But for example, a pair I'd love to see listed are the hexagonal ones either side of the A47 just west of Yarmouth, partly because they're so well preserved, but for me the interesting thing is they're a different design. Their interest is that they're not part of that group. So that's the problem, you know, is if you're only going to list a few, do you do the group or do you try and show the diversity? And there's not a right answer. So what I hope will happen is, if we were having this conversation in 5 years' time or maybe sooner, there would be a whole other batch. Now, in terms of your point about the condition, that's not quite the case as far as I understand it. So for example, the Bradfield one, which is one of the last images I showed that had the red painted steel doors. I mean, that's modern, the red paint. That to me, listen, I'm not an expert on building conservation, but to my untrained eye has a serious damp problem. And whether or not that's going to matter or not, I don't know. But I mean, it's literally pouring down the walls. If you look through the loophole, it's running like a river down the walls. And it's covered with moss on the outside. That's got, I don't know how structurally terrible that's going to be in the short term, but nonetheless, ideally something would be done. And the problem with that is it's partly because the doors have been shut, it means there's less air circulation. So in other words, I don't think it's in imminent risk of collapse, but nonetheless, there's work to be done. So in other words, yes, broadly, there is a batch that have been presented, but there are a few more to include. And someone who knows more than me ought to really survey which event. So again, for example, the one on the Muckleborough Collections land, that was the very last image I showed, that's had to be propped up internally because the roof has cracks in it. So he's actually got that. So Michael Savery's had to jack that up just so there's no danger of the roof caving in. And I say that one at Hanworth is, I'm sure, going to cave in at some point. Yeah. So broadly, yes, but I say that does worry me, because I think there's more to do, and others it would be great to list.
I'm sure the individual landowners are thrilled.
It then brings to mind what the conditions must have been like when they're actually in use, because I should imagine that they probably would have been damp and condensation and cold in there at the time anyway.
Well, do you know what? Well, I know nothing at all to answer what the First World War ones were like, but there's an extraordinary set of images from the Second World War of a pillbox. I think it's near Colchester. I've got it in my book, and the level of luxury is just unbelievable. They've literally got a little stove, they're brewing tea, they've literally got a gramophone to entertain them. I mean, literally. Now, fine, on the one hand, it's been set up for the War Office picture, but even so, I don't think they were necessarily as cheerless as we assume. I've never found it on a First World War one, but you do occasionally get even graffiti in the Second World War ones, where the men who've had long cold nights manning them have put their names down and so on. And in fact, one on the stop line from the Second World War, men who manned them. But yes, but again, they may never have been manned, you see, because the Second World War, there was this idea that they might be coming at any moment. And so some of the Second World War defences were definitely manned. The First World War ones, I believe, were built so that they were ready if needed. But I doubt they were actively manned, and I think that's reflected in the fact that I've never found any graffiti, period graffiti, in any of them. So in that way, that's a key difference with the Second World War, that they're that little bit removed. That I think they were built just in case, and that's all.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Well, there's no more questions in the chat. And I think that's a good point, unless Mary or Adrian or Ian, who I can see have got the videos off, have any further questions. Does anybody else have any questions? No.
I think we've come to the end of the questions.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've got some quite knowledgeable people in the audience, which is good.
Certainly have.
Yes. So may I thank you very, very much, Christopher. That has been fascinating, and I shall certainly go along the River Ant and have a good look. I've certainly seen one or two of those on that bend in the road just outside North Walsham.
That's it. Yes. Yes.
Seen those ones in the past. But I've never been to the Mickleborough collection. Perhaps it's worth going to have a look, especially. Yes.
That's wonderful.
Anyway, thank you so very much. And
thank you so much.
can we all clap? There are little icons of hands clapping all over the screen. I hope you can see them.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and we look forward to seeing the report in the
yes.
newsletter so that we can check up on what we remembered. And thank you again.
Very great pleasure. Thank you.
And can we say goodbye to everybody and remember our February talk from Carol
Rawcliffe.
A surname there, Rawcliffe, which is the Great Fire of Norwich. Okay, so good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.